The ringing of phones echoed through the sleek glass-walled office of Blake Williams, CEO of a once thriving corporation. His hand hovered over the desk, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The room, usually a space of calm control, now felt like a ticking time bomb. The announcement had just been made. The board had voted, and the decision was final. The news was devastating. The company's largest merger was officially canceled. And worse, the reasons for it were now public. A scandal that Blake had worked hard to bury. The media storm hit almost instantly. News outlets bombarded the office with questions, emails flooded in, and the board's trust in him faltered. His eyes darted around the room, but the once familiar walls seemed to close in. Blake had always been prepared for everything, except this. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of his next steps could determine not just the fate of the company, but his own. His phone buzzed again. The message on the screen: crisis. Blake stood before the board, the faces of his colleagues stone-cold and unreadable. His once unshakable confidence now wavered as he faced the consequences of his ambition. "We're not just talking about a lost merger," Blake said, trying to find his footing in a room that felt colder by the second. "We're talking about the future of this company, my leadership, and the trust that's been shattered." The members of the board exchanged knowing glances. Blake could feel their judgment pressing on him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he had the answers. The board meeting stretched on for hours, each word from the board members cutting deeper into Blake's resolve. They questioned his decisions, scrutinized his leadership, and began to distance themselves from him. "You failed us, Blake," one of the directors said bluntly. "This merger was supposed to be the key to our future. Instead, you've led us into crisis." Blake's heart sank. He could feel the walls closing in. He had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation, but now that control was slipping away. Blake retreated to his office after the meeting, the weight of their accusations pressing down on him. He knew the damage had been done, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "I can fix this," he muttered under his breath, staring at the empty chairs in front of his desk. But deep down, Blake knew that his time was running out. The future of the company and his career was hanging by a thread. Blake's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up quickly, his heart racing as he saw the caller ID. It was his trusted confidant, his CFO, who had been by his side for years. "Blake," the CFO's voice was tight. "I've heard some things about the merger. We need to talk, now." Blake's grip tightened on the phone. There was no time left for diplomacy or strategy. His empire was crumbling, and he was running out of allies. Blake sat at his desk, staring at the files in front of him. The situation was spiraling out of control. His once solid team had fractured, and whispers of discontent began to echo through the company halls. His CFO, who had been his closest ally for years, had started questioning Blake's judgment. The last thing Blake needed right now was another betrayal from within. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "We need to meet," Blake said, his voice cold. "Things are slipping, and I don't know who I can trust anymore." His trusted advisor's response was hesitant but clear. "I'll be there in an hour." Blake hung up and leaned back in his chair, the weight of his empire bearing down on him. Was his downfall inevitable? Or could he still save what was left? The meeting with the CFO was tense. Blake walked into a small, secure conference room where his CFO, Amanda, waited. Amanda was always sharp and confident, but today she seemed uneasy. "Blake, you know I've always had your back," she started, her voice measured. "But this merger, you've made enemies, and there are leaks. I've heard people talking, and I'm not sure you're getting all the information you think you are." Blake's heart sank. He had trusted Amanda with everything. "Who's leaking?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Amanda shook her head. "It's not just one person. There's a movement inside the company, and it's growing. People are questioning your decisions, and some are acting on their own." Blake's mind raced as he realized the depth of the betrayal. His empire wasn't just crumbling from the outside, it was rotting from the inside. As Blake walked back to his office, he knew things were worse than he had realized. Amanda's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was against him. The board members, his closest allies, how many of them were secretly plotting behind his back? He couldn't afford to lose any more ground. He slammed the door behind him and dialed another number. "Get me everything on our competitors. I need to know everything now." He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he was sure of one thing. The game had changed, and Blake needed a new strategy. One that would take down anyone who stood in his way. Blake's next move was risky, but he was desperate. He reached out to a rival CEO, Richard Hale, who had been watching his every move for months. "I need your help," Blake said bluntly. Richard's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "I've been waiting for you to ask. What's the deal?" Blake explained the situation. "I need leverage, and I need it fast. I can't lose this company to a hostile takeover, not now. I'm willing to make some unconventional moves." Richard paused before responding, his tone shifting. "I can help you, but it won't be cheap. And once you start down this path, there's no going back." Blake knew the cost, but he was willing to pay any price to stay in control. "I'm in," Blake said. The line clicked off, leaving Blake alone with his thoughts. He had crossed a line, but he had no choice. The deal with Richard Hale was set in motion, but Blake knew it was only a matter of time before things would spiral further. As he walked into the next board meeting, his stomach churned. The room was full of critical voices, but he had no time to listen to them. Blake knew that he had to control this situation or lose everything. "We need to act now," Blake said, standing at the head of the table. "This merger is still our best chance. We're not walking away from this." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, a few of the board members nodded. Blake had regained their attention, but he knew it was only temporary. There was still a war to fight, and this battle was far from over. Blake sat in his office, his mind racing after the recent meeting. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had been so focused on fighting external forces, rivals, the media, board members, that he hadn't paid attention to the people closest to him. The betrayal from within his company wasn't just happening. It was being orchestrated by someone he had trusted. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His CFO, Amanda, entered, her face pale. "Blake, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. Blake raised an eyebrow, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "What's happened?" he asked, his tone hardening. Amanda hesitated before speaking. "It's Richard Hale. He's been working against you from the start. I've found evidence. He's the one behind the leaks, behind everything that's been happening. He wants your job." Blake's heart dropped. He'd made a deal with Richard, not knowing that the rival CEO had been pulling the strings all along. "I never saw it coming, Blake Ma." Blake's mind was spinning. He had trusted Richard Hale, trusted him as a business partner, a potential ally. The deal with Hale had been his last-ditch effort to salvage his empire, and now Blake realized it had been a fatal mistake. He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. He had been too blinded by his ambition to see the warning signs. "How did I miss this?" Blake muttered under his breath. The betrayal stung, but it also ignited a fire within him. He wasn't going down without a fight. If Richard thought he could steal everything from Blake, he was wrong. Blake would take back control. He had to. He wasn't just going to let Richard walk away with his empire. "Amanda," Blake said, his voice cold, "we need to take this to the board. Now." The meeting with the board was brutal. Blake stood at the front of the room, laying out the evidence of Richard Hale's betrayal. "He was never on our side," Blake said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We've been played, manipulated, and I've been too blind to see it." The board members, once loyal to Blake, exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. Some were angry, others seemed uncertain, unsure of who to trust now. One of the older board members, Charles, stood up and spoke. "Blake, you've put us in a terrible position. You brought Hale into this company. You trusted him. And now you want us to side with you after everything that's happened? Blake's face hardened, but he didn't flinch. I've made mistakes, but if you think Richard Hale is the future of this company, you're wrong. He's playing us all for fools. The room was divided, and Blake could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just Richard that was the problem anymore. It was everyone around him, and Blake knew he had to act fast. Blake walked out of the meeting, feeling the weight of the board's decision bearing down on him. The divide in the room had been clear. Some were still loyal, but others had already made their decision. As Blake made his way to his office, he realized that the battle for control had escalated. The room felt cold as he entered, and the once comforting view of the city skyline now felt distant and oppressive. His phone buzzed again, this time with an unexpected message from his former mentor, Greg Harris. Blake, I know what's happening. I've heard the rumors. You're going to need all the help you can get. Blake stared at the message. Greg was a former CEO who had been ousted years ago. His advice had once been invaluable, but now Blake wasn't sure where Greg stood. Still, it was clear that Blake couldn't fight this alone. Meet me tonight. Blake texted back, knowing that this conversation could change everything. That evening, Blake met Greg Harris at a quiet bar. The older man in his early 60s looked just as weathered as Blake felt. You've put yourself in a bad spot, Blake, Greg said, taking a slow sip of his drink. But I know what it's like. Power, trust, loyalty. It all goes out the window when you start making enemies. Blake stared at the man, anger rising in his chest. What do you want from me, Greg? He demanded. Greg chuckled softly. I want you to understand that you're not alone in this. I can help you, but you need to trust me. And trust is something that's hard to come by in your world. Blake leaned in, his gaze intense. What's your price? Greg didn't flinch. It's not about the price, Blake. It's about the power. You want your company back? Then you need to be willing to do whatever it takes to reclaim it. Blake thought about the path ahead, knowing that the choices he made now would shape everything. I'm in, Blake said, sealing the deal that could either save him or destroy him. The clock was ticking. Blake walked into the boardroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The final showdown was about to begin. As he glanced at the faces around the table, he knew this would be the most important meeting of his life. The board was divided. Some were still loyal. Others had already sided with Richard Hale. Blake had one chance to regain control, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. I know what you've all been saying, Blake began, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. But let me be clear, Richard Hale is not the future of this company. I've built this empire, and I will fight to keep it. His eyes locked onto the board members, willing them to understand the gravity of the moment. This is about more than just business. This is about loyalty, trust, and the future of everything we've worked for. The silence in the room was thick as Blake's words hung in the air. Richard Hale, who had been sitting at the opposite end of the table, stood up with a cold smirk. Blake, it's over, Richard said, his tone mocking. You've made your last stand, but the truth is, your time has passed. The words hit like a punch. Blake's hands clenched into fists, but he refused to show weakness. You think you can just take over everything? Blake shot back. This company was built on the hard work of people who believed in it. You can't buy loyalty, Richard, and you'll never have mine. The tension in the room was suffocating. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Blake knew there was no turning back now. Blake's anger surged, but he kept his cool. You've been working behind my back this entire time, Blake said, his voice steady but filled with venom. This is my company, and I'll burn it to the ground before I let you take it from me. Richard's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You don't get it, Blake, Richard said, his voice low. You're not in control anymore. Your decisions have cost us too much. The board is with me now. Blake turned to the board, his eyes scanning each member. Is that true? He asked, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Silence hung heavy for a moment before one of the board members, an older man, spoke up. Blake, I'm sorry, but we've made our choice. Blake's heart sank. The fight was over. Or so it seemed. Blake's mind raced. This was the moment that would decide everything. With the board against him, he had no choice but to play his last card. "I've been making a lot of mistakes," Blake admitted, his voice now quieter. "But I know this company better than anyone. I know the people, the culture, the vision we've worked to build." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And I'm willing to take full responsibility for the failures, but I'm not giving up on this company, not yet." Richard Hale stepped forward, a smug look on his face. "It's too late for that, Blake. You've lost," Richard said. But just as Richard spoke, Blake made a bold move. He released a confidential document that revealed the depth of Richard's deceit and manipulation. The board gasped. Richard's confident demeanor faltered. The tables had turned. The board was in chaos. Members argued and whispered among themselves as Blake stood in the center of the room, his chest rising and falling with the adrenaline. Richard Hale was cornered, unable to talk his way out of this. Finally, one of the board members, Charles, spoke up. "We've seen enough," he said, his voice firm. "Richard Hale, you are removed from this company. Blake, you're not off the hook, but you've just earned yourself another chance." Blake's heart raced, but a sense of relief washed over him. This battle was won, but the war was far from over. As he left the boardroom, Blake knew that the price of power and ambition had been steep. But in that moment, he had reclaimed his place at the top. This is just the beginning, he thought to himself. The real work was about to start. Blake sat alone in his office, the weight of the last few days pressing heavily on his shoulders. The company was still standing, barely, but it wasn't the same. The once thriving empire he had built with so much effort now seemed fragile, cracked by betrayal and his own decisions. The news of Richard's ousting had made headlines, and while the board members had chosen him for now, Blake knew that he wasn't fully trusted. He had won the battle, but at what cost? He had pushed people away, made enemies, and sacrificed values for ambition. The company would survive, but Blake couldn't help but wonder if it was worth the price. "I've come so far," Blake thought, "but I've lost so much along the way." His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Another crisis was brewing, and he knew there would never be a moment of peace. The fight for control was never over. It was only just beginning. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His CFO, Amanda, stepped in. She looked more relieved than before, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Blake, I'm glad things have settled down, but I need to be honest with you," Amanda began, taking a seat across from him. "This isn't just about business anymore. The company's soul has been lost in all of this. People are questioning why we're still here, why we're still fighting for something that seems so broken." Blake nodded slowly, understanding her words. "I know," he said quietly. "But what else do we have? I can't walk away, not now." Amanda studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's not about walking away, Blake. It's about rebuilding, but rebuilding takes time, and it takes trust. Do you have that left?" Blake didn't answer immediately. The room fell into a heavy silence as he thought about everything he had sacrificed. The company was his life, but had it been worth everything he had lost? The days that followed were filled with constant tension. Blake had regained some semblance of control, but it came at a personal cost. The board was still divided, with some members still loyal to Richard Hale's tactics. And Blake could feel the shifting dynamics in the company. Employees were uncertain, their loyalty now in question. Blake stood in front of a mirror one evening, examining his own reflection. The man he saw wasn't the same one who had stepped into this office years ago. He was older, wearier, and battle-scarred. "What happened to me?" Blake whispered. "When did I become someone I don't recognize?" He realized the fight for his empire had cost him more than just his reputation. It had cost him his soul. The weight of his ambition had left him isolated, a man without a clear purpose anymore. He had won the battle, but had he truly won? Blake met with Greg Harris, his former mentor, to discuss his future. Greg, now a retired CEO, listened as Blake poured out his frustrations. "I've done everything I can, Greg, but I feel like I've lost myself in all of this. The company is still standing, but I'm not sure who I am anymore." Greg looked at him with a knowing expression. Blake, you've been chasing power and control for so long that you've forgotten the real reason you started all of this. You're not just a CEO, you're a person. It's time to remember that. Blake's eyes met Greg's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. But what do I do now? Blake asked. How do I rebuild when everything I've built feels so broken? Greg smiled, a faint but genuine smile. You rebuild from the inside out, Blake. You have to rebuild yourself first. The rest will follow. Blake returned to the office the next day, a renewed sense of purpose within him. The weight of the last few months hadn't disappeared, but he knew that change had to start with him. He walked into the boardroom, no longer with the same arrogance he had once carried. He was ready to make the hard choices. We've been through a lot, Blake began, addressing the board. But it's time to rebuild this company, not just the way it operates, but the way we think about it. We need a fresh start. And that starts with me. The board members, once divided, now looked at him with a new sense of respect. Blake wasn't perfect, and he wasn't claiming to be, but he was ready to lead with purpose, to create something lasting and meaningful. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Blake felt hopeful. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. The power of redemption begins with taking responsibility for your mistakes. The phone rang again, disrupting the quiet in Blake's office. He looked at the screen. An unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. Blake, we need to talk, came the familiar voice on the other end. It was Richard Hale. Blake's stomach tightened. What do you want? Blake asked, keeping his voice steady despite the anger that threatened to boil over. Richard chuckled darkly. You think you've won, Blake? You've just been playing a losing game from the start. Blake gripped the phone tighter. I'm done with your games, Richard. If you want something, come get it. Richard's voice dropped to a low growl. It's not over, Blake. Not yet. The line went dead. Blake stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Richard's threat hanging in the air. He had thought the worst was behind him, but now he knew he was wrong. The final battle for control was about to begin, and it wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about survival. Blake knew he had no choice but to confront Richard. He couldn't let the man undermine everything he had fought for. Get me the best security team we can afford, Blake ordered as he paced around his office. Amanda, his CFO, entered the room. What's going on, Blake? She asked, her concern evident. It's Richard, Blake replied, his voice hard. He's making his move, and this time he's not going to back down. Amanda's eyes widened. Blake, we need to be careful. If he's playing a dirty game, we're not just talking about losing the company anymore. We could be talking about losing everything. Blake's gaze softened, but his resolve remained. I know the stakes, Amanda, but I didn't come this far to lose. I'm going to end this once and for all. The showdown took place in the company's conference room, the tension thick in the air. Blake, along with his loyal team, sat across from Richard Hale and his supporters. The room was filled with cold stares, calculated words, and the quiet hum of uncertainty. You've done enough damage, Richard, Blake said, his voice low but steady. This ends now. Richard leaned forward, a smug smile on his face. You really think you can stop me, Blake? I have the board on my side. I have the media in my pocket. What do you have left? Blake stood up, his eyes burning with intensity. I have my integrity, and that's more than you ever had. He turned to his team. We're not going to back down. We're going to fight together. The room went silent, and for the first time, Richard looked unsure. Blake had not only found his voice again, but he had regained the trust of his team. This was no longer a battle for the company. It was a battle for respect. The battle for control was no longer about words. It was about action. Blake had prepared for this moment his entire life. As the meeting unfolded, he presented hard evidence, financial records, and public statements exposing Richard's manipulations and false promises. The truth is clear, Blake said, his voice unwavering. Richard Hale has been using this company for his personal gain, while we've all been working to build something real. Richard's face twisted with anger, but there was no denying it. The truth was out, and it had crushed his empire. The board was silent for a long moment, the gravity of the situation settling in. Finally, one of the board members, Charles, spoke. "Blake, you've won. Richard Hale is out." Blake's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. This victory felt different, harder, earned through sweat and sacrifice. But it wasn't over. It would never truly be over. Blake walked out of the boardroom, his heart still pounding in his chest. The battle had been fierce, but he had won. As he stepped into the elevator, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. The company was his again, but it wasn't the same. He had lost so much: his friends, his trust, his integrity. The walls of his empire now felt colder, more distant. As the elevator doors closed, Blake took a deep breath. He had won, but at what cost? What's next, he wondered. Was this the end of the story, or the beginning of something new? Blake had reclaimed his empire, but he knew the true challenge was only just beginning. Blake stood on the balcony of his office, the city sprawling beneath him. The lights twinkled in the distance, and the sounds of traffic echoed faintly in the background. He had fought for this moment, won back his company, and restored his position at the top. Yet, as he looked out over the city, something inside him felt hollow. His hands gripped the railing, and for a moment he closed his eyes, allowing the cool night air to wash over him. Is this it? Blake thought. I've lost so much to get here, so much of myself. His mind wandered to the people he had pushed away, the friends he had betrayed, the family he had neglected. Was it worth it? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Blake's heart had fought to reclaim his empire, but now it was clear. His soul was the price he had paid. Blake turned away from the balcony, his gaze falling on the empty chair across from his desk. The space once filled with energy and purpose now seemed vacant, as if it were waiting for someone, or something, that would never come. The weight of his actions, the sacrifices, and the choices he had made were all too much to bear. He had spent his entire career climbing, fighting, and striving for more. But now, with everything in his hands, Blake realized that he had forgotten why he started in the first place. The door to his office opened slowly, and Amanda stepped inside. "Blake, you did it," she said, her voice soft but genuine. "You saved the company." Blake didn't respond immediately. He wanted to say something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't feel like I saved anything, Amanda. I don't know what I've done anymore." The days passed, and Blake tried to find some semblance of balance. The company was stable, but Blake was not. The cracks in his leadership had become more apparent, not in the form of public failures, but in the small private moments of doubt that consumed him. The board had moved forward, some of them still skeptical, but willing to give Blake another chance. He had proven that he could fight and win, but he had yet to prove that he could heal, not just the company, but himself. One night, as Blake sat alone in his office, he found himself reflecting on the people who had once mattered to him. Greg Harris, the mentor who had warned him of the dangers of ambition. Amanda, who had remained loyal even when things seemed hopeless. And even Richard Hale, who had pushed him to the edge. Blake had made enemies, but he had also found allies in the most unexpected places. Maybe that's what matters, Blake thought to himself. The people who stay, even when it all falls apart. The morning after, Blake called a meeting with his team. He knew he needed to make a change, not just in how the company operated, but in how he led. "I've learned a lot," Blake began, his voice steady but filled with humility. "And I've made mistakes, serious ones. I've let ambition drive me, and in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters. The people who make this company what it is." The team sat quietly, listening to Blake as he acknowledged the faults in his leadership. "From now on, things are going to be different. We're not just going to rebuild the company. We're going to rebuild the trust we've lost." Amanda exchanged a glance with the others, her face showing cautious hope. Blake's admission wasn't just about business. It was about his willingness to change, to accept that the road ahead was going to require more than just ambition. It would require integrity. Blake stood once more at his office window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the horizon. For the first time in months, Blake felt at peace. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. True success wasn't about power or control. It was about balance, humility, and the people you choose to surround yourself with. He had fallen, and he had risen again, but this time, it wasn't for the empire. It was for himself. As the last rays of the day faded, Blake made a silent vow to never lose sight of what truly mattered again. The empire would survive, but it would survive in a way that was built on respect, not fear. And with that, Blake took a deep breath, stepping away from the window, ready to face whatever came next, knowing he had finally found his way back to the person he wanted to be.